You're listening to WVOF 88.5 Fairfield University, and this is The Sweep with yours truly, Ali Haidar.
And I'm Cole Townsend.
The Sweep is an unapologetically progressive talk show in which we discuss wedge issues and a range of topics in a progressive perspective, one that is rarely conveyed on mainstream media. Today we are joined with a good friend of ours, Wayne Rodriquez. Wayne Rodriquez is a rising junior at American University pursuing degrees in political science and public relations and strategic communications with a certificate of leadership studies. Wayne was born and raised in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Wayne has geared his work efforts towards the political field and his community. He first interned for Congressman Jim Himes in 2016. He was then soon hired to become the campaign manager for a state representative's campaign. Wayne was also elected for a 2-year term as a party delegate for the Connecticut Democratic Party, the youngest elected member in Bridgeport's history. Wayne is also a class senator at American University, and his focus has been on enhancing AU's dining experience, protecting student workers' rights, and increasing transparency when he isn't busy. Wayne, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me here today.
And so I guess as we dive in, we have something, or you have something for us to mention about a cool new little program that you're planning out for this summer 2019. It kind of stems to your works so far in the Bridgeport community. So if you want to explain to us what your initiative is.
Yeah, sure. So lately I've been working on a new nonprofit organization, and I hope to get this fully functioning by the end of the year. It's called the Cuffs to Cops Initiative, which is the second chance job opportunity program for ex-offenders and for police officers to work with the communities even more to increase transparency and communication. So what it basically is once an ex-offender is released, they'll be able to get initiated into a training program, a mentorship program with a police officer for over like a year and a half. They'll begin reaching towards stabilization in their lifestyle. Once they're able to succeed and be able to show growth personally and show change within their community, they'll be able to run for or be able to go for training for within their police department and hopefully become a police officer. So I am really committed towards this sort of issue because I come from a police family. I am really passionate. I was a police explorer. So I think that to give that second chance opportunity and to re-envision what is like criminal justice in our 21st century, I think that's something that would be really significant.
Definitely. I think it's a good way to give back to the community. And I guess just a few questions about it.
Sure.
So I guess for you, criminal justice or prison reform or anything to do with law enforcement, is that a topic that really sticks out to you?
Oh, definitely. I mean, Bridgeport is such a huge area where there's high crime, high poverty, and there's not a lot of opportunity for growth and not being able to just succeed in the long term. It's a poverty cycle, you know? Once you're released from prison, you're only just going to end up back in that same system. So being able to not only try to mitigate that issue, but also increase communication with the community, police department specifically, given the current state of the nation with all these shootings that happened. I mean, you think of Michael Brown, you think of what happened with Trayvon.
Or what happened just recently in Yale.
Yeah, Yale, or even last year in Bridgeport, where there's I forgot the kid that...
Jason DeGroni?
Yeah, Jason Negron.
The 15-year-old, right? I believe the 15-year-old who was shot because the officer feared for his life. I believe the 15-year-old allegedly stole a car. But yeah, I mean, it's crazy if you think about it, how these issues are right in front of us.
Exactly, and because of these issues, there's just a growth of lacking trust. There's just a lack of trust between these individual communities, and I think that by bridging it with understanding what goes on in the lifestyle of a criminal or an ex-offender, and actually, you know, it's like I based it off of my police explorer experience. Just like having that, you know, getting the youth off the street and into the classroom and actually exercising them, so that way not only you learn respect, you learn responsibility, but also become a leader within your community. I want to see that for those that have that issue, where they're not able to get that whatsoever. So I think once you come out and actually do, you know, serve your duty for the community and show, you know, second chance, you know, uncuff the future is my motto for this.
So I'm just curious, you know, it sounds like an interesting initiative. Is this something that is 100% optional where everyone who does it is a volunteer, or is there, a process where there will be like a court mandate for, certain youth crimes or things of that nature?
Volunteer as in for the ex-offender, for the police department?
For the ex-offender.
Yeah, so it'll be completely voluntarily. My idea is that if prior to their release from jail or wherever they're at, the main goal is for them they'll basically be offered to participate in this program. They'll sign a waiver or something stating they must do this, this, and this in order to progress. They must stay in it. They must remain crime-free for about 6 months, so that way they can show that they're able to hold some sort of stability. Even though it's not fully there, at least you'll be able to show that or demonstrate that you're not going back into your previous acts. And I think that's a big thing, because especially that you want to trust the person that you're going to be working with, that demonstrates that. Mm-hmm. So I think that will be for them, but it is completely optional. They don't have to. If they're lined up for something else, if they are part of a reentry program, let them go for that. But I think this is a better way to increase that communication. It's to alleviate income inequality. I know, especially for ex-offenders, the median income for ex-offenders once they're released is about $10,000, with almost, I'm pretty sure, nearly over 40% do not receive any sort of income. So at least I know you'll be trained into getting an income, and you're creating a more diverse police force in the long run. Mm-hmm. I mean, because the way I see it too is also it's geared towards minorities, because there's such a high rate of incarceration amongst minority groups, and I think this allows for that diverse police force that a city desires. I mean, I look at Bridgeport's, where there's a diverse, where 70% of the city is of minority descent, and the police force is only 35% diverse. So there's like a near 40% gap in the share of people that are actually of minorities that is not being represented equally. So I think this will allow that. I just see a lot of benefits over like weaknesses to it. Mm-hmm.
No, definitely. I mean, this sounds like a great idea, and I know that you're still working on getting off the ground, which is good. And yes. It seems like you're working the details out. So I guess, like in summary, so the program is about people in prison, incarcerated, about them when they leave prison. They have this program where they can eventually become police officers.
Basically, it's a mentorship program that leads you into training. Okay. So it's a police officer helping them reintegrate into society.
So I guess a few more questions, because and I'm sure, like I said, you'll figure out the details along the way.
Of course.
So your vision, is this for anyone who's incarcerated, or would this be limited to like felons, or limited to murderers, or people incarcerated of certain crimes, or is this people who only for individuals who may have committed a drug offense? Because we understand that a lot of people today are incarcerated unfairly for carrying half a gram of marijuana. So I guess, and like I said, the details are in the devil, but is there a specific vision? Would this be everyone, or would this be limited in some way?
So right now, the way I have it seen is that there are requirements for who the ex-offender should be, and what recommendations that I would like to provide for the police department itself, so that way it could be most successful. So for ex-offenders specifically, right now we're focused on misdemeanors, because that'll be because those are limited to 12 months and they're not as significant as a felony. What I would like to do in the long run is to start focusing on felonies, because every felony case is different, and that will be done by a case-by-case basis, determining on the person's background, determining on their behavior while they're in prison and what they've done, just in the long run, because I think more people have felonies than misdemeanors overall, and they're the ones that have the toughest time pursuing a career after incarceration anyway. So that's why I would like to focus on them more in the long term. But for now, I think misdemeanors are the way to go, because those are the easiest. Also, younger groups as well, 18 to 35 I'm trying to stick with, especially that police forces require you to be in that age group. If it's anybody older, then it makes it much more difficult. And usually they'll always go back into their old ways if they've done multiple criminal offenses in the long term, and they're much older, so it doesn't really make a difference.
So I'm a little curious because, what was it? You talk about, having this funding essentially to, well, you didn't say funding directly, but you talk about going through and reviewing each case by case. But generally,
in the long run, yeah.
Yeah, generally in these, cities especially, you tend to see low funding for not only the police departments, but also the actual larger criminal justice apparatus. So I hope this isn't an unfair question. Maybe you're still working out the kinks there. Is there any, mechanism to get funding for this? Is there some sort of grant that you've managed to procure for this program to take place?
So I am still working everything regarding funding. I know for one thing, I've reached out to somebody who is a grant writer, and I want to start trying to get federal grants on trying to expand this organization much more. But for the most part, I know that won't be much. The funding, if there were to be funding, it will be to provide stipends for the officers that will commit their time to this, and also funding for ex-offenders who actually show their growth. They'll be able to receive like small increments of cash, so that way they're, if they're having a tough time reaching that stability, at least they have something to at least live somewhat of a decent life, even though, because they have families too, a lot of these individuals. So at least that little extra makes such a big difference, especially if they're not able to get a career within that 6-month bracket. But I would like to get funding to get counselors and program advisors, so that way we're able to actually oversee what's going on, and conduct surveys. I need facts. I need data. So that's going to be the crucial part of how this whole pilot program works. But for the most part, funding will be done. There won't be much funding, because the way I see it too is how police officers, these will be on-duty police officers during the daytime, and that's when there isn't much going on. Anyway, it's usually nighttime that a lot of events occur. So if it's 1 to 2 hours a week, and these officers are just committing just short amount of time with this person, that's what makes the difference. Anyway.
Definitely. And I'm assuming this program is first going to be geared towards Bridgeport?
Yes, that's where I primarily based everything, because Bridgeport has such a huge crime issue and huge inequalities just based upon the surrounding areas of Fairfield and as a whole. And it's the city I'm most connected to as well. I mean, I was born and raised in Bridgeport, so being able to serve my community in this aspect, I think, is what matters most to me. And I'm really committed towards focusing on building it here, especially that it's a small city, medium-sized city, and there is this high diversity rate, which is where this is also geared towards. So if I'm able to fulfill this area, then I want to expand throughout Connecticut. I would like to go to New Haven, Hartford, Waterbury, and then if those cities are able to implement this to see a noticeable difference in how crime is, and if they're able to hire them, I'd like to expand outward, but...
Definitely. So I guess what my last question is, and I think we don't want to ask too many questions, because a lot of the details in the devil, right? We don't want to, you're still working it out, and I'm sure a lot of these questions would be answered in the process of you laying it out.
Of course.
I guess my question is, and I spoke to you about this a few weeks ago, when you had mentioned the program or initiative, the public's response to this.
Yes.
I know that law enforcement, the incarceration system are all sensitive topics in the U.S. One side will argue one thing, the other side will argue another thing when it comes to, law enforcement, like standing your ground. And I guess I could already imagine, maybe not so much a problem in Bridgeport, but maybe branching out to other cities, people who might be, because of ignorance, lack of knowledge, or because simply they don't feel comfortable, people becoming police officers who were previously in jail. I guess how would you respond to that?
So first thing, like people not becoming being very uncomfortable with having an officer. I actually spoke with a waitress yesterday. I went to a restaurant. I spoke with a waitress, and she had a really close friend that was incarcerated for about 15 years. I forgot what the offense was, but he came out, he cleaned himself up, and he's now a police officer within the city.
Really?
Yeah, and I think stories like those is what I would like to see to come from this. The big part of this is to humanize the ex-offender, because we all want a second chance in life. We all make our mistakes. We did our due diligence. It's our time to pursue our destiny and achieve a new future. And to be able to provide that opportunity for a new future would be through something like this. And nothing's better than to give an ex-offender, especially if they've done harsh crimes in the past, a second chance, and they're serving the communities they once were part of that were, that drove them to this low level. So since they know, they understand the community, they will know how to fix this issue. And I actually wrote a PR plan for this whole issue, and it's just basically, I want to focus on uncuffing the future. Look at who this person is, look at their life, what they've had to struggle through, and actually showing what it means to actually to guide them and become someone that is just a brand new individual. Think of it.
Clean slate.
Yeah.
I think you made a really good point when you said it's about humanizing the individual.
That's all it is.
The whole point of prison, I think a lot of people forget about this, is to rehabilitate people and bring them back into society. And there are a few cases for egregious behavior such as murder and like rape where that might not be the case, but rehabilitation, and people forget about that. So, I'm excited about this, this plan, this initiative. I think it's a bold idea. I think it's super ambitious, and I think that there's a lot of potential for it. And these coming months, we're excited to see where it goes, and we definitely love to learn more about it in the future.
Oh, definitely. It's definitely a very ambitious project. That's something I could say. This all comes from my leadership program. We're all supposed to do a social action project, and originally I just wanted to do fundraising for the Police Explorer program that I did, but I wanted to do something more ambitious, something that actually does something for more people.
For the long run, too.
For the long term. So I think this is something that actually staples that sentiment in. So
definitely. So there you have it, folks. Cuffs to Cops. Be on the lookout for that by Wayne Rodriquez.
C2C initiative.
Yeah. So I guess moving on, and, Wayne, as you might know, The Sweep is a really unapologetically progressive talk show.
I heard in the intro, yeah.
Yeah. So, and, we like to have different nuanced views come on the show. We've had, former guest Nick Toledo, who, holds different views, especially about what his preferred candidate in the 2020 Democratic primary. And so, I guess for you, Wayne, who is your 2020 candidate and why?
Oh. Let's hear a great question.
Listen. We're unapologetically, but that doesn't mean we can't be civil.
Oh, I know. Nah, we've always discussed this.
Yeah.
No, Mayor Pete is the way to go for me. I know that
Pete Buttigieg, mayor of South Bend, Indiana. Wayne Rodriguez, his number one pick.
Yeah, he is the number one for me. I just really admire his connection with the people, his message through that way. Because as someone who wants to be like mayor of my city, or who idealizes becoming that position, I understand his view where it's like you are the closest to the people when you are a mayor, because you have to localize yourself with them, and you have to understand what their issues are in order to get elected. When you become part of Washington, you really disconnect yourself, and especially when you're serving over 700,000 people, it's just very difficult to understand every person's issue and actually be able to fill that issue when you're elected. And not everybody's views are even recognized during that. You can live in a majority Democratic area, and yet you still have those few minority views that do not get their recognition that they deserve.
It's this whole idea about unity that squashes out opposition, but...
So, to an extent, that all sounds great, but I do have a few points of contention right there. The first being, it's certainly good for, a mayor to be, localized, and yes, to an extent, I do believe that you do get a little, spread thin when you become, a national politician, when you spend a lot of time in Washington, but, personally, I berate Donald Trump partially because he's inexperienced, and I don't really think that he's qualified to be president. What makes, Mayor Pete a mayor of a relatively small town where there has been, a fair share of problems and mishaps under his leadership, what makes him eligible to be president, and also what specific policies, because, Ali's talked about this before, he is not exactly a policy wonk, he's a sentiment guy, I guess you could say.
He's all about, and we'll talk more about this, but he's all about the philosophy, what you preach. And I guess, as you were saying, Wayne, for those, people know me and Colin, we are, Bernie Sanders fans, right? Elizabeth Warren comes second for us. And a lot of the reasons why Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are our top two is because we agree with their policies, we agree with their philosophy, but we also agree with their with how they kind of hold themselves. And so I'll let you respond to Colin in a second, but we'll talk. I more so have a problem with Buttigieg, specifically with the policy part, but also even certain things that he's done as mayor. Whereas I think it's fine and dandy if you speak 7 different languages.
Cool, yeah.
I think it's cool. I think it's great, and I think it really shows how cool or how much America has progressed. At least the Democrats have in terms of the idea that we can have a gay candidate, which is great. Mm-hmm. We need that. But as we discuss this even more, I just think there are certain things that Pete Buttigieg and certain things that he did, and the lack of, not being a policy wonk. And I have a Vice interview which I'll get into in a bit. But I guess what your take would be, to what me and Colin are saying. I guess more specifically, you were a Bernie Sanders fan in 2016.
Yeah, and I still am. I have nothing against Bernie. I think he's a good man. He's very honest with his constituents for the most part, and to everybody that he speaks to. I love his ideas on income inequality, economic inequality, and just enforcing antitrust laws and breaking these corporate banks and everything. I think that's that really speaks to me, especially how just this whole area. I've grown up in economic inequality all my life, and it's affected me, personally, socially. So it's just something that I really do favor in his life. So, or in his words, So he's number 2. But
I just think because from my perspective, maybe you could enlighten me about your perspective. I just think Pete Buttigieg and Bernie Sanders are 2 radically different people with 2 radically different approaches.
I'm definitely inclined to agree. Once again, Sanders is someone who has lots of policy, and that's why I asked the question specifically, what kind of policy do you support from Pete Buttigieg? Because as of right now, and to be fair, lots of politicians come out.
Absolutely, yeah.
They run, like Joe Biden, for example, and they don't really have any policy when they start running, which to me is a little concerning from any politician. But Pete Buttigieg has made it his brand by discussing the fact very publicly that he's more concerned with philosophy. Personally, I'm a little oblivious as to how you have a philosophy that is not manifested in the form of policy. So once again, can you talk to me about what kind of policies you support from Buttigieg, and if there are none specifically, why that doesn't matter to you as much?
Well, I'll say is that how many actual candidates have true policies established is still very on within the primary season. I personally don't know when actual Iowa caucuses are specifically, but or the date of that, but I know it's not until sometime next year. Or late this year. So there's still time for policies to be composed from all the candidates, not just Pete. But to that idea, I really think that he is someone that is just he's just more inclined. He's a very good speaker. We all know that.
Okay, yeah.
Just based upon how he speaks and how he's committed. And he's definitely radically different from Bernie in that idea. But he has to be radically different because of where he comes from. He's speaking more to the Midwest and the evangelicals, the very religious people. I mean, he had a article, or I read an article today about how I think it was with how God didn't have a political party. He didn't agree to it. He accepts all people for who they are. He's really trying to speak to that Midwest, the Bible Belt. He really wants to appeal to that demographic. Whereas Bernie, I feel like he is definitely more geared towards the urban areas, and he's definitely trying to speak upon them.
Well, I mean, perhaps Buttigieg might have more sway with the evangelical vote, though. I would be a little surprised considering the fact that he is gay, but when it comes to, the Rust Belt, Bernie Sanders actually has significant appeal and pull within those areas.
And so to speak, he's in 3rd right now, which is pretty impressive.
Yeah. But, so while you say that, so maybe what separates them would not necessarily be the Rust Belt, because once again, Sanders has that too. It would more be the Bible Belt, and I'd be interested to hear more about that, because I'm surprised to hear that a, gay millennial man would curry the favor of the Bible Belt.
I mean, just to echo what Colin said, and don't think of us as like, it's tough because we're two Bernie supporters.
I'm trying to come. I understand. I'm trying to come off
completely
the
understand where you're coming from. I think there are certain things, going off the Midwest. I mean, Sanders destroyed the Democratic primary in the Midwest against Hillary Clinton. I mean, Sanders is he's the favorite because he's for unions. I mean, and just to echo something that I do agree with you. I do think it's early in the primary season. I think typically for people to come out with policies, but I don't think it hurts. I mean, you look at Elizabeth Warren; she's been chugging out policies left and right.
Well, she has to get her recognition out there somehow because she's being dominated by like Kamala. I think Corey, he's been making waves. Beto, it's very hard. It's a very difficult campaign season because there's almost 20 candidates now.
Absolutely. Even Pete Buttigieg is beating Elizabeth Warren in the polls, and I mean, arguably a lot of that comes from the media coverage. I mean, Pete Buttigieg has been left and right on the media, and I think he's become an establishment favorite. And I guess, Colin, it's interesting about the whole evangelical thing. Pete Buttigieg is a religious guy, and I don't deny that he's religious, but I think the American evangelicals are mostly on the right, and I don't know if they'll budge on the idea of homosexuality, whereas like Mike Pence called him out. I think Franklin Graham, both huge leaders on the evangelical, and these aren't people who speak for the entire evangelicals. I just think it would be difficult to. I think it's stupid how they play his sexual orientation down, or they kind of try to exclude him from the Christian community. But I think he'd have a tough time there.
He's redefining the way that you can look at it because think of it just like in the last 5 to 10 years, is how everybody has increasingly become more favorable towards homosexuality. Mm-hmm. And I think he's trying to speak to that as in, don't worry about who I am and who I love. Worry about what I advocate for, how I speak, And I think and the thing with him too, I think he really appeals to all the core demographics. He's going to have a tough time get like African American votes. But I know for a fact, he's gay, so he could appeal to the LGBTQ plus community. He could definitely appeal to the Midwestern Rust Belt, the Bible Belt, because of his religious views. He's very intellectual, so I feel like he could definitely get a lot of the core demographics. So
I do want to push back on something just a little bit that you said a while ago in regard to it's early in the primary field. You can't really fault a politician for not having a strong set of policy goals out there. And I want to say that just because it is a norm that politicians run for office and worry more about testing what is popular as opposed to having a vision that they launch with and that they push for, does not mean that it should be the norm and does not mean that it should be accepted any longer. That's how we get change. Mm-hmm. Once again, I do support people like Liz Warren, like Bernie Sanders, like Mike Gravel, because they do have very strong policy platforms. And I think that's really important because the American people for too long have been, they have been served platitudes and they have eaten on that and they have made that their main political diet. And I think Buttigieg, in a way, is kind of a microcosm of that. Like you said, he, is well-spoken. He has, the LGBTQ appeal. And so, I mean, for the longest time, neoliberals have had this idea of, rather shallow representation within, a few key figures in order to attract our attention away from the fact that they don't really have good policy. Like Hillary Clinton had terrible economic policy as far as I'm concerned.
Yes.
And her campaign, it was, I'm with her, right? So highlighting the fact that she's a woman. How about, for working families or something like that, doing something that would really help people, right? So I think Buttigieg, in a sense, is like a microcosm for that.
Well, here's the thing. I mean, and I'm going to read off an interview with Vice that Buttigieg did. And Buttigieg isn't indifferent on the idea of policy. He's actually anti-policy. He mentions this in this interview. I'll read it out loud. So the interview asks, quote, "I listened to you talk today. On the one hand, you definitely speak very progressively, but you don't have a lot of super specific policy ideas," unquote. That comes from the interviewer. Buttigieg responds with this, quote, "Part of where the left and the center left have gone wrong is that we've been so policy-led that we haven't been as philosophical. We like to think of ourselves as the intellectual ones. But the truth is that the right has done a better job in my lifetime of connecting up its philosophy and its values to its politics. Right now, I think we need to articulate the values, lay out our philosophical commitments, and then develop policies off of that. And I'm working very hard not to put the cart before the horse, unquote. And so he by this interview, he takes an anti-policy position. And I think I completely disagree with him, because I think, if anything, the left has been too philosophical in a way, how we're talking about how we want to eliminate income inequality, we want to help minorities through affirmative action, but we don't put out policy proposals when we run for office. And I think I don't think the right does the same thing, but it doesn't mean we should do it. I mean, if it might work for them, but it definitely does not work for the Democrats. And so that's where I think Pete Buttigieg is. What distinguishes him different than Kamala Harris or any other person or any other establishment candidate that hasn't put up policy. I mean, he's no different. Whereas if they all preach the same thing, I mean, yeah, he might say one thing, but he hasn't pulled out anything specific. And and just a little backup. I mean, even Sanders, a fair point of criticism for Sanders is that he hasn't been as wonky as Elizabeth Warren. However, the platform that Warren is running on, the platform that Bernie is running on, is Bernie's platform from 2016. And in fact, he's put out policy proposals such as his Medicare for All, and he's backed certain ideas from the Green New Deal. And, in another interview with Vox, they just, describe about specific proposals where, Buttigieg has come out, like in the interview with Vice, when the interviewer says that he speaks progressively, this is what kind of Vox says in their interview. He says that, and then they say that Buttigieg has, endorsed a single-payer healthcare system, but he proposes, starting out with like a transition policy, which is different than like what Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren want. He's also said that the Green New Deal sounds like a, quote, sound framework for tackling climate change, and he's called for the withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan. And with the former, I mean, he says sound framework, but that doesn't mean he's endorsing it. Doesn't mean he's in any way. It kind of means he's against it.
That's vapid politicians speak for. I am not going to put my position out there, so when I get into office, you can't really say that I made any particular promise.
Absolutely.
So, like, when I think of philosophically speaking, I think of being able to listen to what everybody's saying and actually take that in consideration before actually coming out with policies, because I think coming out with policies very early in a game, I think they'll just lead them to become forgotten in the long term, unless that candidate is going to keep reverberating what they're advocating for. But for the most part, media is going to pick it up and it's going to drift away, because the media cycle is just constant, and I just don't. And I think, just in particular, I think it's okay to be a little philosophical, but I think over time he's going to develop more policies with the more people he's going to speak to.
So when it comes to listening to people before coming up with your policy proposals, I mean, look at Bernie's policies already based off of what people want. People overwhelmingly support Medicare for All. They overwhelmingly support. Even among Republican camps, even among Fox News camps, raising taxes on the wealthiest Americans. They overwhelmingly support free college, free public universities. These are all things that, and I want to point out that one of the few things that Buttigieg did concretely say is that he's not for free college, because he didn't feel it was fair for non-college goers to supplement the pursuits of those who do get to go to college. But so I think if you're talking about listening to the people, you're already there. And I also think it's important, once again, a leader has to lead. And if your argument is that, you have to articulate what you're fighting for over and over and over again to not get drowned out by the news cycle, then great. Because, I think a politician should have to consistently articulate what they're standing for. Because if they don't, there's ample room for them to change what they're standing for. Look at, Beto O'Rourke, who supported, Medicare for All initially in his senatorial campaign, and he was, about to become a Justice Democrat. Eventually, he backed off of the idea. He backtracked. And there are numerous other things, like his anti-fossil fuel pledge. Beto O'Rourke went on to become the second largest recipient of fossil fuel money. So, I think you do have to consistently state your message.
Well, and just to go on that, by the way, Beto O'Rourke is back on that pledge. A few days ago, he announced that he's back on the pledge.
He's awesome.
He's a mess. But here's the thing. The Sunrise Movement has even confirmed it. And so I'll let you respond, Wayne, but if you want to respond.
No, it's just like, I can understand being consistent with the message, but if, culture changes over time, and if people change their values and the way they think, and you don't want to do anything too radical that will also turn away people as well, because it could cause an economic crisis if you immediately initiate something, especially if you do something such as free 4-year public college, or if you immediately do that, that's going to be very
well. I guess
it's going to hurt. How our finances are affected, especially. I know, Warren, she wants to eliminate debt from of people who have $50,000 to up to $100,000. That's good idealistically, but realistically that'll devastate people. And it's unfair to people that have already are almost about to pay off their debt, and then it's intend people to drive up their debt even more in order for it to be paid off.
Well, here's the thing. I mean, so about policies. Go back to your point you made a few moments ago. Sanders, he came out with policy proposals in 2016 right there, and look at where he is now. He's legit dragged at least the Overton window on the left to more towards the left, towards these policies. And so here's in terms of economic crisis. In terms of the tuition thing, I think the only economic crisis, I don't even call it a crisis, but the only economic issue
is a debt-based economy that we have.
Well, it would be in New York State, right? They have tuition-free public college. For a certain income. The only issue is they're competing with private colleges now, and they have an advantage over that. But that doesn't really matter when it comes to New York University or Columbia, which are private, high elite institutions who don't have to worry about competing, but more so smaller colleges like Canisius College, for example.
Shout out.
But that's yet to be seen, and that's the only issue I could see economically, because you're giving me an advantage. And so I just think. Your people, I think, and the whole issue of, with people, how it's unfair for them to, to wipe out debt when they're almost done paying for it. I'd be careful with that, because that's a conservative talking point, and not only is it a conservative talking point, but it's a really wrong talking point. Not because here's the thing, right? We've talked about this before. I mean, if you could say that for almost anything, right? Why should we end slavery where I've become a freed slave? Why don't they, quote, work to become a freed slave or something? I mean, that's a far-fetched analogy, don't get me wrong. But, I mean, there are other things, right? For instance, like Medicare. Why should everyone else have the government pay for their health insurance, whereas 20 years ago I paid for an expensive cancer surgery? It's just super regressive. And I'm not saying and that's a point that's been made, and I think that's a point been debunked. And I don't think you wholeheartedly mean that in a way.
Well, I don't know too much on the topic as well.
Well, absolutely, that's the thing.
But I know for one thing, I do. It's just it's going to be one of those things where people are just going to want to people will feel inclined to raise their debt only to actually just get it canceled out by the time they get to that point.
Well, I want to push back on two things. We'll handle the debt thing later. First, I want to mention the fact that you mentioned Democrats don't want to do something that will turn off, a large swath of voters. I want to point out...
Well, not just Democrats. I think just for the entire population, you don't want... If it becomes unfavorable, it's going to hurt the Democratic Party in the long run.
But, what I want to point out is the fact that Democrats have held that mentality since at least the 90s. They've said, hey, the country is, right. We have to get these people who are, quote-unquote, in the center. That means we cannot go too far left. So even though in their primaries they weren't even that far left, as soon as they got to their general, they would swing more to the right. Guess what? In our lifetime, we've had a lot more Republican presidents than Democratic presidents. But moving beyond that, it just has proven to be a disaster. I mean, when you have Democrats saying, hey, we, don't want to turn off swaths of the public, we're going to do, what people want, and we think people are right-wing, you get things like our issues with mass incarceration and privatization of prisons.
Yeah.
Well, so going off of that, I guess kind of moving on, Pete Buttigieg also in town hall, and this kind of relates to Cuffs to Cops, your initiative, which is wonderful. This idea, Pete Buttigieg said that if you're incarcerated, you shouldn't have the right to vote. And I don't know, and Sanders, that basically comes from the fact that Sanders said that you should have the right to vote. Me and Colin believe that you should have the right to vote if you're incarcerated, like while you're serving your prison time, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Before prison, you should have the right to vote. In prison, you should have the right to vote. After prison, you should have the right to vote. Pete Buttigieg has come out and said that while you're serving time in prison, you should not have the right to vote.
While you're serving your time?
While you're serving your time. So I guess what's your take on that? Because, I mean, like you said, incarceration matters a lot to you, and I think it's an issue that I think Buttigieg is on the wrong side of this issue. I think that because it's a slippery slope. When can you take someone's right to vote away, right?
That's interesting because I've actually never thought of that issue in particular. I've rarely heard anybody talk about that. But I guess personally, like I would support having people. You know, if you're in prison, it is a constitutional right to vote. So I do think whether if you're incarcerated, not incarcerated, you should definitely have the right to vote. Mm-hmm. So sure, I may not agree with everything Buttigieg says, but I know for one thing that either way, at least he still allows after incarceration, you can still vote. I mean that because I think essentially all Democrats running for 2020 right now, I can't imagine any of them coming out and saying
I think
ex-cons should not be able to vote.
I think he's talking about like felons. I think Buttigieg does support felons when they leave prison, the right to vote after you leave.
Yeah, that's my point. I don't think there's anyone in the 2020 primary field right now.
No, most Democrats favor having the right ex-offenders having the right to vote.
I just think that.
But that is interesting, though. I remember
it was during his town hall and CNN town hall, and I think he's just wrong on that. I think he's like Colin said, he's appealing too much to the center, and I guess also kind of moving on, talking more about his mayor. We've thrown Buttigieg in the meat grinder, and we've torn him apart when it comes to him being anti-policy and his poly proposals. But I guess, talking more about his mayor, I found an article by CNBC, and, they kind of went into South Bend, and they kind of talked to a few people. They also cite, a poll by people who live in the South Bend who have said that, half the city's residents have said that their neighborhoods haven't improved over the previous 5 years, according to a poll in the South Bend Tribune, which is the local paper. And even in this article, Buttigieg, they talk to someone, and someone says, "Quote, I would like to live in an actual neighborhood where people are," unquote. And that's the issue with South Bend. I guess it's being depopulated. There's not a lot of people living there. And Pete Buttigieg has been a mayor, I think, since 2011. And so I guess maybe you could add on. What have you heard any successes coming from from South Bend? Are you shocked that people feel this way, that things haven't happened in South Bend?
I actually do have a friend. She actually lives in South Bend, and we've had a conversation about how he has been as a mayor, and basically she was discussing how she's noticed differences. It's just a matter of people actually recognizing those differences.
Do you mind if I ask you what her race is, ethnicity?
She's a white woman.
Okay. So, nothing wrong with that. I'm just saying, like, a lot of these people, and BuzzFeed did a great article about this a few months ago, about how Buttigieg, I guess, and don't quote me on this, but allegedly Buttigieg gave the go in demolishing buildings. And like how you said in the beginning of the show, you think Buttigieg is going to have an issue with getting to African-American voters, which he probably will. I mean, his record in South Bend.
And Bernie's having that tough time, too, trying to connect with them as well. But I think he's been growing on them. But it takes time.
I actually want to point out, that's actually, I'm sorry I keep doing this to you, but that's actually a really false narrative that keeps being peddled. The notion of the Bernie bro being this, white, belligerent male supporter of Bernie, that stems from 2016. It was more true then, but still overblown. And in 2019, it's just not true. He's doing really well within the African American community and other minority communities. He's doing just as well with women as he is men.
He has a better chance this time around because he doesn't have Hillary to compete against. And Hillary had that very good, because of Bill, he had that very good connection with the minority population versus him.
I think he's doing a pretty good job. I guess he's not competing with Hillary, but he's competing with Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, all people who
are actual, black people, instead of just being related to the first quote-unquote black president.
Well, he has better recognition than both of them.
It's not even that. I mean, notable black intellectuals have come out and supported Bernie Sanders. I mean, Nina Turner, who was a state senator from Wisconsin or Michigan, I believe, is currently working on his campaign. She's a very loud, progressive voice in the black community. Cornel West, a famous academic, has come out. I believe Angela Davis and Mark Lamont Hill may have floated the idea. I'm not sure because if they've fully endorsed it, but they're definitely leaning towards Bernie, I think. So.
And, I mean, like, we've talked about this before on the show, this notion of, like, linked fate. African-American voters tend to, vote similarly due to, a strong sense of what is good for the group is good for me, what is good for me is good for the group. And right now we're seeing that linked fate is lining up, it always lines up Democrat, but within the primary, it's lining up with Bernie. I think there's something to be said for that. So, that's why, once again, like, I just wanted to push back on that. And, like you said, it's not just that he has, great people who are coming out and supporting him publicly. His team also is comprised, of a very diverse group of people.
That's something about him, though, that's always been good about him. He's always had a very good, diverse team.
That's
and
true.
I think that's a lot of these Democratic candidates now because they recognize that, since there's such a strong young voter sentiment that they want to see diversity, and because of that, you need a multicultural strategy in order to have a strategy. Like, you need to have some sort of diversity, especially that we're the most diverse and inclusive generation there is, and we're the largest generation now. You need to have that multicultural strategy in order to be successful. So that's a big tactic that they've been doing, and you got to be careful too because, sure, Bernie may have that, growing connection with that community, but you do have Biden, and he is a very strong man, and he has that connection with Obama, and a lot of people still see him favorable in that aspect.
Well, I mean, here's the thing. I will say that had this been like 3 years ago, if Biden probably could have secured the black vote. To this day, I do think that a lot of black voters would vote for Biden, but I think we need to keep an eye out on what's going to haunt him from the 90s. I mean, Anita Hill, a black woman.
Incarceration.
Incarceration in 1994.
The criminal justice bill
in
was
the 70s,
huge.
He was against
desegregation, right?
Right, yeah. and the busing going on. But I do want to say, actually, like, there's this idea that, like, black people showed up in force for Obama. There was like a 2% spike in the black vote for Obama during his first election. I don't know if Biden's association with Barack Obama is enough to get him, quote unquote, the black vote. But you talked about, having a multicultural strategy in order to have any strategy. And that being said, Ali, you were talking about a little bit about his record. So let's get into, 5,000 homes in 500 days or whatever. The initiative that essentially ended up being gentrification, and 2, let's discuss. And I want to point out, I do think that initiative was well intentioned. And 2, let's also discuss the controversy with what has gone on in his police department. So, I'd love to hear your takes on both of those.
So what do you want to hear first?
So the campaign to get rid of, a bunch of homes that were not up to snuff, which ended up, while I think was well-intentioned, ended up having a gentrifying effect. And then, secondly, the whole police force controversy.
So, but in the case of gentrification, while it's never the best thing to do, especially that you're removing the people from their actual location, it's the only way to increase property values and economic development within an area, so that way you can actually build an actual economy within a city. I mean, look at Bridgeport and every other major city that's faced urban decay and deurbanization. It's been very difficult to actually find ways to attract investors to actually come in the city and to actually start developing. And
I mean, just to echo that, I mean, I agree. I think gentrification is inevitable in some cases. However, it doesn't necessarily mean it has to be unaffordable.
Of course. I mean, if I was like a mayor of a city, I think, having a fair balance of affordable housing or rent control, I think is a really, really big thing, because I know, like in D.C., it's very expensive to live, and there are apartments that are rent controlled, so that way it can be affordable for the few. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, It doesn't. We don't want anything to be unaffordable, but that's just how economics works. It's going to become more expensive if you don't implement processes where it will be more.
Well, I would think that
affordable for them.
A lot of developers, when they come to like gentrify an area, they have to go through a lot of activists and protests. And there are activists out there who will try to negotiate with these developers, be like, the government won't mandate rent control. However, we're going to ask you guys to keep the prices low. And sometimes the developers will say yes, sometimes they will say no, and it's just a matter of whether or not they'll keep their promise. So I think because rent control is an issue, right? Most economists will say that it leads to shortages because you're putting like a price ceiling in a way. But
yeah. So I want to bring up, because you mentioned that gentrification in a sense can sometimes be the only way to boost property values and bring money into a community. Though you do acknowledge the detrimental effect of displacing people.
I think it's terrible.
But I do want to point out, if you look at things like Black Wall Street, wherein the black people within a particular community were able to take control of their own economy, their own stores, their own schools, their own police forces. They did extremely well for themselves, right? So I think initiatives like that, especially if they start from within the community, but even if they're started from without, but they're focused on people within, are great. There was also this goes back to like maybe the 80s or the 90s. It's pretty old, but I think the city might have been called like Rockville, Massachusetts, or something like that. It was this place in Massachusetts. It was dilapidated. It was forgotten about.
Could be Maryland, because I know Rockville, Maryland.
Maybe. What I remember is corporations would literally dump trash in these abandoned lots. People, just like in Bronx in the 80s, would routinely set apartment buildings on fire to collect the insurance money.
South Bronx is bad.
And when a group of, would-be gentrifiers came in and discussed their plans to rejuvenate, the area, some people, led by a group of teens, said, hey, now, actually, we're going to secure the power of eminent domain for ourselves, take control of these locations, and we're going to have the community build homes and parks. And because they were built through the volunteer power of these people, they could be provided cheaply, subsidized. And we're going to let people who literally were forced out of the community later on because things were so bad to come back in and to live in these homes, right? So I think when we talk about gentrification as being like a necessary evil, I think it's because we have been forced into a false dichotomy, and we think that it's that or urban decay. I want to point out there are other, more grassroots ways of getting that going, and I think that, starts, I'm going to get a little Marxist here, but, that starts with some class consciousness on a very, very, very localized level.
Well, I think, like I said, I think gentrification somewhat kind of is inevitable, like I said, but I think that it's controllable in a way where it doesn't hurt people. Kind of building off this whole idea of class consciousness, or this idea of they have to work with, activists.
That's interesting how they're seeing communities come together and actually gentrifying their own community in their own way. Mm-hmm. I think that's what we need to see more of. It's more involvement from the community to actually be advocates for, retaining what's valuable to them. Because the problem and the bad thing about gentrification, you lose that historical sentiment, that, the mm-hmm. value and the culture that was once there. I look at, D.C., Shaw, and U Street. Those were huge black communities. And now a lot of it is becoming gentrified, and a lot of these people are being pushed out to, Maryland specifically. Mm-hmm. And it's very sad because these are areas where go-go music was popping. You had jazz. You had a very vibrant community. And now it's just most of it is getting eliminated because of what's going on. And it's just because you don't get that voice. You don't have these people coming out and actually speaking mm-hmm. to the developer what they would like to see. Instead, the developers just come into the city and just tell them what they would like to bring. There's no communication. There's a disconnect, and that's a big problem.
Absolutely.
I definitely agree that that's an issue. And I'd say we have, about 6 minutes left. Like I said before, I'm definitely interested to hear your take on the whole police debacle in South Bend. Do you have any particular takes on that? Do you think that'll harm him in regards to the black community?
I guess before going to that, could you explain the police debacle? Because as much as I'm on the news, I have not heard about the police debacle.
I don't know too much about it either.
Okay, so I have heard about this in passing from the Young Turks, so I might butcher the story a little bit. But it is my understanding that police officers in South Bend were, recorded saying some rather racist things, right? Which that does, of course, bring into question how you are policing the community and who you are policing if you are expressing racist sentiment, right? And this was something that was expressed by numerous people within the police force. I believe, Buttigieg claims that, these tapes were recorded illegally. He has not listened to what is in the tapes as a result because he would not want to break any of the laws. But he did fire the person, I believe, who, procured the tapes.
The whistleblower?
Yeah, the whistleblower, so to speak. And I believe there may have been a demotion of a black police chief under his watch as well.
There was a demotion, yes.
Like I said, I didn't follow the story too well, but I am aware of the fact that for people who are following Buttigieg's record, admittedly, he's not much of a candidate for me, so I'm not, following too much. But for people who are following that to be critical of him or to look into him, that's a big thing. So, I'd love to hear your take on that, whatever details you may have.
So let me just first state, I don't know too much about the issue either, so I'm going to be very off the cuff. I was just quickly reading a New York Times article about the whole situation. It's basically everything that you said with some other details. But the thing is, it's just, I don't know. It's it's a very interesting situation. I'll admit to that. But it's definitely a leadership crisis under his part because this has to deal with, minority officer and the issues that prolong, especially that this occurred before the Trayvon Martin protests I was reading. So this was a very hostile time when this occurred, in just socially. Yeah. So I think the only thing I'm going to say is that I will do more research on this, but.
Fair enough.
For the most part,
come back to the Bernie side.
He's my number two.
Make him your number one.
If Mayor Pete falls out, I'm all on Bernie because I do believe what he advocates for, and I do want to build upon.
So I guess as we're wrapping up, Wayne, thank you for coming on the sweep.
Thank you for having me. This was definitely interesting.
This was a great conversation. I mean, you are on the left as us, maybe not as much on the left. But, it's great to have differing views, and we talk about, I could not ask for a better episode in which we rip on Pete Buttigieg for an hour.
I gotta say, though, it does feel a little bit unfair because there's, two of us.
Absolutely, like I mentioned in it.
Next time, can we try to get another Buttigieg supporter, at the same time? Or,
Alex Satinsky, where you at?
I'd love to get Alex.
I need Alex. Where is he, man?
We'll bring Alex on. But anyway, for those of you listening to the sweep, thank you so much. We're sorry for that 2-week break, but we are back. Finals were getting a little tough. But we plan on continuing the show over the summer. So definitely check out our YouTube channel. And we plan on still broadcasting from WVF.org.
You wanna give our Twitter handles before we?
Yeah, if you want to follow me on Twitter, my Twitter is Lebanese Ali, LEBANESEALI.
Not actively on Twitter. Follow me on Instagram. It's _Wayne's World 1.
And I am on Instagram, Mark's God Cole.
Is that your actual tag?
That's my actual tag.
Wow. What about your Twitter?
Cole. I'm sorry, did I say Instagram? I meant to say that's Twitter.
Oh.
So I am on Twitter as Mark's God Cole.
Nice. Anyway, those of you listening, thank you so much for listening. We hope to see you next week.